18 million Americans froze as Jasmine Crockett spoke just 41 words and shattered the most dangerous lie a sitting president ever told. On live TV, 10 feet from Donald Trump, she didn't blink. She didn't yell. She exposed. What happens when the truth doesn't flinch, but power does? This is a story worth every second of your time. The WCTV studio in Tempe, Arizona was running on schedule. Lights, warm scripts, crisp, and the hum of normalcy filling the air like white noise. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat quietly in the side studio, waiting to go live for a segment on voting rights. Nothing controversial, nothing explosive, just another night of talking points and policy frames. Then it happened. The main anchor's voice faltered mid-sentence, and the studio's rhythm shattered like glass under a hammer. And if you ask me, Trump said, his voice booming through the live feed, Obama committed treason. The man should be tried. 8 words. 8. That was all it took. A silence crashed down, the kind that hums louder than sound. Leslie Tran, the anchor on set, blinked twice, shuffled her papers with fingers that suddenly looked too stiff. Off camera, the control room detonated, producers, yelling, phones ringing off the hook, fact checkers, scrambling like firemen to a 5-alarm blaze. What had just happened? No script had prepared them for this. No training covered the moment the President of the United States called his predecessor a traitor on live television. Jasmine didn't move. She stared at the screen as the words repeated like a glitching echo in her mind. Treason, treason, not disagreement, not policy critique. Treason. The gravity of that accusation wasn't political, it was constitutional, spiritual even. She could already feel the temperature rising around her, the oxygen being sucked from the room as a storm surged into motion. In the side studio, an intern dropped a water bottle. It hit the floor with a sound that felt like a gunshot. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her phone buzzed once, twice, then again. Texts from her team, friends, reporters, allies, all saying the same thing in different words. Are you going to respond, Elijah? Her chief of staff leaned in through the studio door. You're up in 5. You sure you want to touch that? She didn't turn her head. He lit the match. I'm not letting it burn unchecked. Her voice was low measured, but inside her pulse was climbing like a siren rising. She stood, adjusted her navy blue jacket, ran a hand along her braid to center herself, and walked. Each step down the hallway to the main stage felt like walking into a furnace with no flame retardant gear. People parted as she moved past. Some whispered, some stared. One young assistant gasped quietly as Jasmine passed her, an audible intake of breath, like seeing someone step onto a battlefield. On set, Leslie Tran was still composed, but barely. Her smile was tight, like it had been stapled on. Congresswoman Crockett she greeted as the mic was clipped to Jasmine's lapel. You've heard the president. Your thoughts? Jasmine didn't speak. Not yet. 1 beat, 2. The red light above the camera clicked on. Live. She leaned forward, not in aggression but precision. Her voice was soft. Deadly. Words have consequences, Leslie, especially when they come from the highest office in the country. Silence. She had everyone now. To accuse a former president, one who served with honor and transferred power peacefully, of treason. That's not reckless. That's dangerous. Her hands were clasped on the table. No shaking. Her jaw steady. But her eyes were fire under ice. And in that moment, every American watching understood something unspoken. She wasn't just reacting. She was taking control of the room. What happens when someone doesn't just survive the fire, but walks straight into it with their voice as the match? The camera was live, the nation watching, but Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. Leslie Tran hesitated, her voice cracking under the weight of what had just erupted from Trump's mouth. But Jasmine stepped in, not out of bravado, but necessity. The air was electric tight, like a drum about to snap. And Jasmine, sharp-eyed, composed, unblinking, was the blade cutting through it. Her voice came low at first, deliberate, almost surgical. Words have consequences, Leslie, especially when they come from the most powerful office in the country. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It carved. The silence that followed wasn't dead, it was bracing. Every technician, every producer behind the glass wall, every viewer on their living room couch could feel it. This wasn't a quote. This was an intervention. She didn't pause for comfort. She leaned in the camera, catching the glint in her eye, the resolve that vibrated just beneath her stillness. Accusing a former president, one who served with honor, who handed over power peacefully of treason, that's not politics. That's propaganda. The word hit like a baton across a shield. In a room built on tight-lipped moderation and softened sound bites, she was rewriting the rules in real time. Behind the scenes, Leslie's producers scrambled, unsure whether to cut to commercial or keep rolling, but Jasmine gave them no space to escape. Let's be clear. She continued, her hands calmly folded in front of her. Treason isn't a term you throw around like a football on a bad news week. It's the only crime explicitly defined in our Constitution. Her voice never rose, but the pressure in the room did, climbing like a storm surge under glass. Leslie, searching for a foothold, tried to interject. But he says Jasmine didn't raise her hand. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply spoke over it, cool and precise. He says a lot of things, but facts don't bend to fit his story. They're stubborn like that. Boom! A single sentence, and suddenly the room belonged to her. You could hear the breathing change. Even Leslie shifted in her chair, shoulders stiffening, not out of defense but awe. Jasmine wasn't performing. She was prosecuting. In the case, the soul of a nation being dragged through mud on national television. My father served 2 tours, she said, her voice softening, just enough to land heavy. He taught me what patriotism is. It's not a red hat. It's not a slogan. It's not standing in front of cameras yelling at ghosts. It's doing what's right, even when it costs you something. The words didn't just float, they struck. Veterans watching clenched their jaws. Students leaned closer. And somewhere in Ohio, a history teacher reached for the remote and turned the volume up. Then she did what only the most fearless do. She turned her gaze straight into the lens. She wasn't talking to Leslie anymore. She was talking to the country. If the president truly doesn't understand what treason means, she said, her voice a steel cable wrapped in silk, then we've got a problem much bigger than what he said on TV. It was devastating in its precision. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't accused anyone of anything irrational. And yet the emotional impact was seismic. Not because she shouted, but because she didn't need to. She had become the stillness in the center of a political hurricane. As the red light blinked on the camera, marking the end of the segment, Leslie Tran sat frozen. Her script crumpled slightly in her hand. Jasmine unclipped her mic, stood up with quiet authority, and walked off the set like she had just finished what she came to do. What kind of woman walks into a storm with no umbrella, no armor, just the truth? Leslie Tran cleared her throat, her hand twitching toward the teleprompter like a lifeline. But Congresswoman Crockett, surely the president meant it rhetorically. Her voice was strained, like someone trying to defuse a bomb with a paperclip. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her voice remained anchored in the storm, steady and deliberate. Treason isn't rhetoric. It's not metaphor. It's not spin. Each word came like the slow turning of a key inside a lock that had rusted shut for too long. Leslie tried again, nervous smile tightening. But don't you think, no, Jasmine said, cutting in, not harsh, not loud, but immovable. We don't get to soften this. We don't get to pretend he didn't just accuse a man who led this nation with dignity and restraint of a capital crime. We don't get to smile through that. The air in the studio thickened heavy with something more than silence. It was realization, collective and growing, that what had just been said wasn't some offhand political jab. It was an attack meant to wound something deeper, memory, history, the thread of stability that held democratic discourse together. Jasmine shifted slightly in her seat, not in discomfort, but in control, like someone about to deliver a closing argument, not to a jury, but to a country. My father didn't fight overseas, so his children could grow up in a nation where the word treason gets used as a distraction. He taught me that patriotism isn't just about flags and anthems. It's about standing guard over the truth, especially when it's under attack from people in power. Leslie looked down at her notes, searching for a transition, anything to pivot the moment back to safety. But Jasmine wasn't finished, not even close. She leaned forward, hands clasped, and spoke with a quiet that hit harder than thunder. If the President of the United States doesn't know better than to accuse a former commander-in-chief of treason without a single shred of evidence. She turned her head slowly, eyes meeting the lens. It wasn't a stare. It was a mirror. Then we've got bigger problems than who said what on TV. The words landed like a final gavel. No crescendo, no background music, just stillness. In the control room, a producer whispered Jesus under his breath. One of the camera operators exhaled like he'd been holding it the entire segment. And across the country, millions of people leaned in, not for drama, but for something rarer truth that didn't flinch. Leslie didn't speak. Couldn't. The moment had shifted beyond her hands, beyond scripts, beyond the limits of televised pacing. It was no longer a broadcast, it was a reckoning. Jasmine leaned back, her face unshaken, her breath even. She had said what needed to be said. Not to provoke, not to perform, but to place a line in the sand with surgical calm. One you couldn't walk back from. The red light above the camera dimmed. She unclipped her mic, stood up, walked off set without looking back. The studio remained still, as if afraid to exhale too soon. What happens when someone finally refuses to stay silent? The answer wasn't in what she said. It was in what followed the silence. Jasmine hadn't even reached the parking lot when her phone buzzed once, then twice, then lit up like a flare in a midnight sky. Mentions, exploding notifications cascading like an avalanche. Her name wasn't just trending, it was erupting. Elijah jogged beside her, phone pressed to his ear. Breath clipped. Yes, we saw it. No, she won't clarify. Yes, it's everywhere. The SUV door closed with a thud, sealing her inside, while the outside world burned with digital fire. By the time the car pulled away from WCTV's studio, Jasmine Crockett had hit Twitter's global trending list at #4. 2 minutes later, #1. Not just a name, now a movement. Hashtags flared like sparks across platforms. #Crockett, calm, #Treason, takedown, #she did not blink. News outlets scrambled for clips, quote, graphics takes. The media frenzy wasn't building, it was detonating. Inside the vehicle, Jasmine sat still. Calm on the outside, but her pulse thudded like war drums. Her screen was a blur, praise from civil rights leaders. Tweets from veterans, DMs from students, a cascade of allies and enemies alike. And beneath the applause came the poison. Photoshopped nooses, messages dripping with coded threats. Traitor protecting traitors. Ungrateful black liar. Stay quiet, girl. Elijah read aloud from the seat beside her, words tumbling in disbelief. CNN's calling it the most composed shutdown of presidential disinformation ever aired. He scrolled faster. MSNBC's rerunning the full clip every 30 minutes. Even Fox admitted, you weaponized restraint. Jasmine didn't flinch. She was staring at something else. A screenshot from a high school classroom in Kansas City, projected behind a black teenage girl standing at the front of a whiteboard, her face. And on the board in thick purple marker, words have consequences. The teacher had captioned it, today's civics lesson hit different. Jasmine turned her phone toward Elijah. Her voice was low, unwavering. That's why I can't let them rewrite this. At the hotel, 5 new interview requests were already stacked in her inbox. 2 cable networks, 1 foreign bureau, 1 podcast, and 1 curious entry, a retired federal judge's assistant asking for a transcript. That was the shift, not clout, but credibility. Jasmine sat at the edge of the bed, slipped off her heels, exhaled for the first time in an hour. The news still flickered on mute. Her face sliced into headlines, some reverent, some hostile, all re-edited for narrative. She watched her own words get chopped, rescored, diluted. No, she said suddenly. Post the full transcript, uncut, tonight. Elijah paused. Before they spin it, she nodded. Before they steal it. 20 minutes later, her official site crashed from traffic. A backup server launched. The headline was simple. These are my words. Read them. Then decide. By midnight, over 2.1 million people had downloaded the document. From high schools, fire stations, diners, public libraries, even a prison in Georgia. The numbers weren't just impressive, they were intimate. Jasmine wasn't just a politician anymore. She had become a signal. And signals don't disappear, they echo, multiply, burn through static. So as she sat there exhausted, barefoot and quiet, Jasmine realized something. She was no longer reacting to power. She was becoming the counterweight to it. And counterweights don't apologize. They balance the truth. The notifications didn't stop, not when the sun dipped behind the Phoenix skyline. Not when Jasmine finally sank into the hotel armchair, and not when the news cycle spun toward midnight with her name still pulsing in the ticker. Her phone vibrated every few seconds, not from noise but from weight. Each message was a thread pulling tighter around her ribcage. Veterans thanking her for protecting the Constitution when it felt abandoned. Teachers recounting classrooms that erupted in debate. Strangers typing from diners, living rooms, hospital beds. Some proud others scared most just awake for the first time in a long time. A retired sergeant wrote, "My son thought patriotism meant yelling. I showed him your clip. Now he's asking what it means to protect something quietly." A middle school teacher from Atlanta messaged my 8th graders watched. They didn't cheer. They listened. Even a woman from a tiny town in Wyoming, someone Jasmine never expected to hear from, wrote, "You don't look like me, but tonight you spoke for me." Jasmine read them in silence. No dramatic music, no grand revelation, just the quiet ache of resonance settling deep in her chest. And then her phone rang. She glanced down at the caller ID. Uncle Rodney. She hadn't spoken to him in months, not because of tension, just the kind of distance that comes with too many flights and too few front porches. She hesitated, thumb hovering, then answered. "Hey, baby girl," his voice cracked on the first word. Older now, slower, still carrying the same bass as her childhood memories. "I don't want to keep you," he said. I saw it. Twice. Once alone. Once with your aunt. I kept thinking." He paused. Jasmine waited, breath caught halfway in her chest. "Your granddad would have been proud as hell." Her eyes welled but didn't fall. "You think so?" she asked softly. "I know so," he said, firm now. He always said the hardest thing in America was telling the truth when everyone's profiting off the lie. "You did that. On TV. With the whole damn world watching." The call ended with a promise to visit soon, but Jasmine didn't move from the chair. Instead, she let her mind drift back to Dallas, to the heat-soaked summers of her childhood, to the narrow house with wood-paneled walls and that plastic-covered couch that squeaked when she sat. Her grandfather would sit in his worn recliner, remote in one hand, cigarette in the other, barking at the television like the anchors could hear him. He never raised his voice at her, but he raised it often at injustice. She remembered one night clearly. She couldn't have been more than 9. A news segment had mentioned espionage, and the word treason scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Her grandfather pointed at the TV and said, "That's the worst thing you can do. Sell out your country from the inside. Ain't no crime dirtier than that." She'd asked him, "What happens to someone who does that?" He didn't blink. They pay, one way or another. Now, decades later, that same word had been flung recklessly by the man in the highest office, aimed not at a criminal, but at a man who carried himself with restraint. She knew this wasn't just about policy. It was about memory, about the elders who'd taught her to honor words because they were the last thing the powerful couldn't take away. And here she was on a national stage using that very word not to divide but to defend its meaning. Outside, the Arizona night was quiet, but inside her chest, legacy thundered. Because this wasn't about trending, it was about tethering. Tethering her voice to every person who had taught her silence was not always peace. And now the question was no longer whether her words had landed. It was, what would she do with the millions who had just leaned in to hear them? By sunrise, the internet had turned into a battlefield, and Jasmine Crockett was at its center. News panels cracked open like landmines. Pundits lined up like prosecutors on a Sunday sermon, dissecting her every syllable with surgical contempt. Irresponsible, unhinged, a calculated attack on national unity, barked one anchor, his tie twitching with every exaggerated syllable. Fox News framed it as a dangerous precedent, a junior congresswoman accusing a sitting president of weaponizing lies. MSNBC played her quote on loop, reverent like scripture. But in the shadows of social media, the real storm was gathering teeth. Anonymous accounts began stitching together doctored images, spliced audio, twisting her clip until the truth bled out. Hashtags multiplied, hashtag radical Jasmine, hashtag unpatriotic, liar, hashtag Crockett crisis. Bots flooded her mentions with nooses, burning flags, and the usual cocktail of racism wrapped in concern. One message simply read, "You should have stayed quiet, girl." It wasn't fear that crawled up her spine, it was recognition. She knew this tactic. Smear, then isolate. Isolate, then erase. In the war room of her Flagstaff hotel suite, her team moved like a crisis unit. Screens blinked with network feeds, social dashboards, real-time analytics, spiking like a heartbeat on a crash monitor. Elijah paced. Noreen, her comms director, scrolled furiously, muttering, "They're cutting context left and right. They want a sound bite, not the truth." One aide whispered, "Maybe it's time to pull back. Just let the clip ride out." Jasmine looked up slowly. Her voice was low but final. "No, that's exactly what they want. Me small, me scared." She picked up her phone, opened Twitter. Her fingers hovered for a split second before she typed, "The president knows my name now." That's the problem with telling the truth. You become a threat to the lie. I'm not scared. I'm focused. She hit send, and the internet cracked open again. Within 20 minutes, it surged past 100K retweets. Journalists reposted it without commentary because none was needed. Celebrities jumped in. Professors reposted it on class slides. And a woman in rural Tennessee tweeted, "I've never felt seen by Washington. Tonight I do." Jasmine scrolled, eyes steady, pulse calm. The fire wasn't dying. It was catching. But the real fire came from what she didn't do. She didn't retreat. She didn't issue a statement of clarification. She didn't apologize for being too blunt, too black, too bold. She refused to let her truth be edited by anyone who didn't have to carry it. The threats kept coming. So did the praise. The line between both became blurred, relentless, exhausting. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Every smear was confirmation. Every attack a mirror reflecting exactly why she'd spoken in the first place. Late that night, after hours of interviews declined and damage assessments logged, she stood by the hotel window. The city was quiet, lights soft, the world unaware of the chaos orbiting just one floor below. Elijah walked in and said softly, "They're organizing something big tomorrow. Online right now, boycotts, protests, even threats of recall." Jasmine turned from the glass. "Good," she said. "Let them show their hand." He paused, uncertain. "You think we're ready for that kind of pushback?" Her eyes narrowed, not in anger but focus. The minute you speak a truth they can't control, they either try to own it or destroy the one who said it. She stepped back into the room. "Let's see which one they try first." The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was preparation. How far will truth-tellers be pushed before the country realizes it isn't just their voices on the line? It's its own reflection. It didn't take long for the silence to mutate into strategy. By morning, the White House press briefing room felt less like a podium and more like a firing squad. The press secretary stood stiffly behind the seal-flipping pages, with the confidence of someone delivering a rehearsed blow. Then came the line, calculated, cold, and dripping with code. "It's unfortunate when angry, ungrateful individuals try to distort the president's words for attention. But people like that don't usually last long in Washington." The room held its breath for a beat. Cameras whirred. Reporters scribbled. No one asked for clarification because they all understood exactly who that meant. Jasmine Crockett, first-term Congresswoman, black, female, loud in truth but calm in delivery, which made her even more dangerous. The phrase "people like that" echoed like a loaded chamber, racist, sexist, and deliberately deniable. Plausible dismissal wrapped in professional language, and Jasmine heard it loud and clear even from 3 time zones away. She was mid-meeting with her staff in Flagstaff when the clip reached her phone. Elijah handed it over silently. She watched it once, then again, then handed it back. "They didn't flinch," she muttered. "Didn't even bother to pretend it wasn't about me." Noreen, her comms director, was already typing. "You want us to respond?" "No," Jasmine said. "Let them dig the hole deeper. We'll be ready with receipts." But the hole had already widened. That afternoon, an anonymous profile dropped on a political gossip blog known for its backdoor access to right-wing operatives. The headline was slick and venomous, Crockett's Rage. A history of division masquerading as justice. It oozed with vague insinuations, citing unnamed law school peers, a controversial college op-ed she barely remembered, even a distorted quote from a panel she once sat on in 2018. The article hinted she once supported radical separatist ideas, painted her as erratic, overly emotional, hostile to traditional American values. No sources, No documents, just shadowy claims and the perfect storm of plausible slander. It spread fast. Cable news didn't touch it yet, but fringe platforms ran with it. Pundits clutched their pearls on podcasts. A former staffer from an opposing campaign tweeted, "I worked with Crockett once. She was always looking to start a fight." The bots took over from there. By evening, her Wikipedia page was being edited every hour. Old photos were being recirculated and falsely labeled. And beneath it all, the comment threads grew darker, more violent, more precise. Someone posted a photo of her Dallas home. Another threatened her mother by name. A third account shared a map of her Flagstaff hotel floor plan, likely fake, but meant to rattle. Inside the suite, the energy had shifted. The jokes had stopped. Phones were set to silent. Staffers moved like soldiers in a bunker. Noreen's voice had dropped an octave. Elijah's eyes were bloodshot from hours on high alert. Jasmine stood at the window again, arms folded, her silhouette cast in shadow against the city's yellow haze. But something had changed. The fear hadn't crept in, but the isolation had. Not because she was alone, but because she knew she couldn't afford to feel alone. Not now. Not when the playbook was so clear: gaslight the public flood, the zone with lies, then erase the truth by exhausting the one who dared to speak it. "They think I'll fold," she said finally, her voice low almost to herself. "They think if they make me feel small enough, I'll vanish." She turned away from the glass and faced the room again. "But I didn't come to Washington to be liked. I came to leave a mark they couldn't wash off." The room was silent. She was not. And the question now was no longer whether they'd come for her. It was how much louder would she get before they broke trying to silence her. The attacks came like clockwork, measured, coordinated, relentless. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't huddle in silence or shrink into the fog of speculation. She stepped forward. Because when power punches down, history only remembers the woman who hit back with facts, not fear. That morning, while headlines questioned her temperament and pundits smeared her character, Jasmine's team was already loading the next strike. She stood in front of a whiteboard in the corner of her makeshift hotel war room, sleeves rolled up, fingers smudged with marker ink. Bullet points scrawled in sharp, defiant script: treason definition, military code, past presidential language, DOJ timelines. This wasn't about spin. This was strategy, not just to defend her reputation, but to expose the rotted scaffolding behind the smear. "No more reacting," she said without turning. "We speak first. We frame it. We bury the lie in daylight." Elijah looked up from his laptop. "Want to go with the quote we drafted for CNN?" Jasmine shook her head. "Too safe. Too sanitized. They want me to sound careful. I'm not here to soothe them. I'm here to remind them I exist." She reached for her phone. Her fingers moved fast. Not polished, not edited, real. "The president doesn't have to like me, but he can't erase me. You don't get to call truth treason and expect silence. Not anymore." She hit post. The tweet sliced across timelines like a blade through fog. Within 20 minutes, it was being read aloud on MSNBC. By lunch, college students in Ohio were writing essays about it. By evening, it was painted across the cardboard signs in downtown Chicago. Her words had stopped being a response. They'd become a declaration. Next came the op-ed, titled "The Constitution is Not a Prop." Drafted in a single sitting with Noreen, it was published in The Atlantic and reprinted in 5 regional papers. In it, Jasmine wrote, "This country was built by people who were told they didn't belong, who were told to be quiet. I won't apologize for clarity. I won't apologize for being visible. This moment doesn't scare me, it sharpens me." She didn't wait for interviews to come to her. She chose them. Local outlets, college, radio podcasts run by veterans and school teachers. Unscripted, raw. She didn't soften her tone or repackage her words for comfort. In one interview, when asked if she feared political backlash, she smiled and replied, "If telling the truth ruins my career, then maybe I was never meant to stay silent in it." Her voice didn't tremble. It tremored not from fear, but from anchored intent. Everywhere the noise tried to compete. Headlines mocked rival campaigns, whispered talking heads tried to twist her into a caricature. But Jasmine didn't flail. She pivoted from defense into pure velocity. Because clarity, once ignited, has no brakes. It only burns forward. In the hallway outside her next interview, Elijah caught up to her tablet in hand. Your quote's been reprinted 7,000 times in 36 hours. Even foreign outlets are running with it. Jasmine adjusted her collar, checked her mic, then looked at him dead on. Good. Let them know the volume's not going down. It's going where it should have been the whole time up. And as she stepped onto another stage, another camera flickering red with records, she knew something had shifted. They came to bury her voice, but all they did was amplify it, because power may control the microphone, but courage rewrites the message. And now the question wasn't who would attack her next. It was who else might finally find the courage to speak. The next tremor didn't come from a tweet, a camera, or a press room. It came from a dusty op-ed tucked into page A7 of the Cincinnati Register, penned by someone no one expected to speak. Linda Marston, retired federal prosecutor, Reagan appointee, sharp-tongued, and known for bearing political opinion beneath mountains of case law. Her title was blunt. Crockett was right, treason is not a toy. But it was her opening line that detonated across the political landscape like a fault line snapping under pressure. The Constitution doesn't bend for feelings. It demands evidence. What Jasmine Crockett said wasn't radical. It was legally correct and morally necessary. The article went unnoticed for a few hours. Then someone posted a screenshot to Reddit. Then it hit Twitter. Then Rachel Maddow read it aloud, nearly word for word on live TV. Within a day, Marston's words were being cited in legal classrooms, bar associations, and political think tanks. Jasmine's inbox lit up not with noise, but with precision. Law students asking for permission to quote her. Professors reshaping syllabi around the incident. A retired Navy JAG simply wrote finally, "Someone read the damn thing." But the bigger shock came from across the aisle. Jasmine was standing in a hallway between back-to-back interviews when Elijah stepped in, phone pressed to his chest, his expression unreadable. "You've got 5 missed calls from D.C., 2 were press, 3 were congressional." She raised an eyebrow. Who he exhaled: Mark O'Neill, Republican, Kansas, and Emmett Moss, Ohio. Jasmine froze. Neal had once filibustered a racial equity bill with a Bible quote. Moss chaired the subcommittee that had once blocked her amendment on prison reform. These weren't allies. They were cold, firm adversaries. She didn't return the calls immediately. She let them linger like smoke in a closed room. Later that night, a clip surfaced from a local town hall in Columbus. Moss stood in front of a small crowd of veterans taking questions without a script. One man asked about Jasmine. The room held its breath. Moss didn't dodge. He folded his arms and said, "I don't agree with a lot of what she stands for, but I watched that clip. She didn't lie. In fact, she showed more backbone in 10 minutes than some of us have in 10 years. You could hear the breath suck out of the room. Then applause, not explosive, not thunderous, but real. By morning, the clip was everywhere. Conservatives called it a rare moment of honesty. Liberals called it a crack in the wall. But Jasmine didn't call it anything. She just watched. Quiet, steady. And when a reporter shouted at her during a Capitol walkthrough, asking Congresswoman, "How do you respond to bipartisan support from men who've criticized you in the past?" she paused, turned to the cameras, and replied, "Truth doesn't come in party colors. It either survives the noise or it doesn't." Then she walked on. Behind her, the press didn't move, because the ground had. Inside her office that evening, Elijah placed 2 printed messages on her desk, both unsigned, both from Republican offices, both carrying nearly identical lines. "We don't say it aloud, but we heard you. And you're not wrong." Jasmine looked at them for a long time before folding them in half and placing them in her drawer next to a worn photo of her grandfather in uniform. The air felt different now. Not calm, not chaotic, just calibrated. Like something had finally begun to realign, not in her favor, in truth's. And now the question hung heavier than before. Can truth really reshape alliances, or just reveal who was waiting for someone else to say it first? It was past midnight when Jasmine's phone rang, the kind of hour where bad news usually lives. She sat up in bed, still in the blazer from her last interview screen, casting a pale light on her face. Unknown number. She hesitated. Every instinct told her to let it go. But something in her gut, a daughter's radar, a pull from somewhere deeper than politics, made her answer. "Hey, baby," the voice cracked, familiar and fragile. It was her mother. Jasmine closed her eyes and leaned back the storm outside her world, suddenly quieter than the one on the line. "Mama," she said softly, "you okay?" Her mother exhaled like she'd been holding it for days. "I should be asking you that," she said. "You were on every channel tonight, saying things that most people don't even whisper at the dinner table." Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't know how, because this wasn't just a check-in. This was a reckoning. There was a pause, the kind that only exists between people who've lived through each other's silences. Then her mother's voice dropped to a whisper. "You sounded like your grandfather." Jasmine's throat tightened. She saw him again, not in memory, but in sensation. That living room in Oak Cliff. The couch with plastic that stuck to her legs in summer. The scent of ivory soap pipe smoke and slow-cooked greens. And his voice gravel and gospel barking at the evening news like it owed him answers. "He used to yell at that old TV," her mother continued. "Always said, one day someone's going to say it out loud with a mic in front of them, and the world's going to flinch." Jasmine smiled through the sting in her eyes. "He did say that, didn't he?" "He did," her mother replied. "And tonight you were that mic." The weight of those words landed like scripture, not heavy like a burden, but solid like a backbone. They talked for 15 minutes, about groceries, a neighbor's broken fence, her mama's church friend who still thought Twitter was a kind of medication. Nothing political, nothing dramatic, just anchors to a version of life untouched by cameras and press cycles. Then before hanging up, her mother's voice turned serious again. "Just promise me one thing, Jasmine." She waited. "Don't let them break you." Jasmine's heart thudded once, not in fear but in recognition, because she'd seen too many broken ones, too many voices that went hoarse from shouting truth into the void, too many spirits hollowed out by fighting battles alone. "I won't," she whispered. "I promise." When the call ended, she sat for a long time in the hush of the hotel room, staring at the faded wallpaper. She wasn't thinking about sound bites or strategy or what headline would scream her name next. She was thinking about a man in a recliner, holding the Constitution in one hand and a lifetime of disappointment in the other, praying someone would carry the burden he never got to. And she realized this fight wasn't new. It was inherited. And for the first time in days, Jasmine didn't feel surrounded. She felt held. Because when home finally calls, it doesn't ask who you've become, it reminds you who you always were. The hotel room was dark, but Jasmine's mind wouldn't dim. Headlines blurred, voices clashed, and the pressure of 1,000 opinions weighed against her chest. Fully closed, she lay still, afraid that moving might crack the fragile wall between strength and collapse. Silence didn't bring rest, it brought volume. She shut off the apps, closed her eyes. Then came a new alert, not news, not noise. Just a photo. A teenage girl from Nebraska, braces and chipped blue polish, had posted a picture of her mirror. Taped to it in shaky handwriting, "If the president doesn't know better, then we've got bigger problems." The caption, "I want to say the truth, even when I'm scared." Jasmine sat up, heart slowing the fire in her chest, no longer frantic, but focused. That mirror wasn't a fan tribute. It was a reflection of what mattered. She remembered being 15, staring into her own mirror, wondering how much of herself was too much for the world. Back then, no one quoted black women on bathroom mirrors. Now her words had found their way into someone else's courage, and it hit harder than headlines, because this wasn't about trending anymore. It was about reach. And Jasmine realized some nights you don't need rest. You just need proof you're not alone in the dark. By morning, the war room was no longer defense, it was strategy. Jasmine scanned the list of interview requests glowing on Elijah's tablet. Major outlets eager for sound bites. But she wasn't offering fire for clickbait. Not this time. Noreen laid out the color-coded options. Most want it live. Cutaways, talking points. Jasmine didn't flinch. "Who wants full format?" Noreen flipped 2 tabs. "Toledo." "Birmingham." Jasmine nodded. "Book them? They're small," Elijah said. Jasmine's voice was sharper. They asked with respect. "That's the currency now." Outside, protesters swirled supporters, critics, media in orbit. But inside, Jasmine moved like a general. Her notes app blinked open. At the top, bold and centered, "Don't fight for the mic. Fight for what it carries." Her grandfather had once said after a lost high school debate, You didn't lose because you were wrong. You lost because they twisted your sentence into their slogan. That warning had never felt more alive. She scrolled through outlets again, slow, deliberate. Each yes or no wasn't strategy. It was survival. She wasn't building a moment. She was building memory. We don't chase the echo, she said. We build the source. Elijah smiled. You're not reacting anymore. Jasmine looked up. I'm remembering. And in that remembering, exhaustion didn't disappear, but it bowed to clarity. Because when noise gets loud, the still voice that doesn't shake, that's the one people follow. The studio in Toledo didn't look like much. No glowing ticker, no high-budget lighting grid, just one camera, two chairs, and a woman named Arlene Glass, who had been doing this long before viral clips dictated who got airtime. Jasmine sat across from her, the silence before the taping heavier than it should have been. Not oppressive, just loaded. Like both women understood that what was about to happen wouldn't just live online. It would live in people. No countdown. No dramatic intro music. Just a quiet nod from the cameraman and then Congresswoman Crockett. Arlene began, her voice like gravel and patience. Why do you think so many people reacted the way they did? Jasmine didn't blink. Because truth, real grounded constitutional truth, cuts through noise. And we've been living in noise for so long, people forgot what clarity sounds like. She didn't come to defend herself. She came to explain what it felt like to speak plainly, and then watch your words be sliced, rebranded, and tossed into a media blender for clicks. They called me angry, she said calmly, but I didn't yell. I didn't even raise my voice. What I did was tell the truth, and that's the part they can't metabolize. A calm black woman speaking facts that terrifies them. Arlene didn't flinch. She leaned forward. Do you think the word treason still holds meaning in this country? Jasmine's lips parted slightly, not to hesitate, but to steady the freight of the answer. It should, she said. But when it's thrown around to distract from real investigations, when it's used to smear someone who governed with integrity, then it becomes theater. And democracy doesn't survive on theater. It survives on evidence. The room didn't move. The lights buzzed faintly. Outside, a storm was beginning to gather over Lake Erie. But inside the studio, the temperature was still because authenticity had frozen everything in place. Jasmine spoke about her father again, about how he used to watch the evening news with his Army medals still clinking in the drawer behind him. She talked about the first time she saw media reduce someone like her into a headline, and about how hard it is to walk into a room knowing they've already written your label before you open your mouth. I'm not here to be palatable, she said, voice firm but not sharp. I'm here to be accurate. And that doesn't always look like smiling through a slap. Arlene sat back, visibly moved. No cue cards, no follow-up prepared. Because sometimes truth doesn't need a format, it just needs space. And as the interview ended, no one said cut. The cameraman simply lowered his arm. The room stayed quiet, not out of discomfort, but reverence. Because when spectacle falls away and all that remains is truth, you remember what real conversation sounds like. By the time Jasmine stepped out of the Toledo studio and into the gray drizzle of Midwestern daylight, her words were already on fire. Not loud, alive. The clip wasn't slick, wasn't polished, but it pulsed with something the country had been starving for: sincerity without spin. Within hours, the line began surfacing everywhere, first on niche blogs, then on cable banners, then across major platforms in bold block letter headlines. Silence is no longer neutral. It wasn't just quoted, it was claimed. High school debate teams scribbled it on whiteboards. TikTok creators mouthed the words over clips of protests, rallies, courtrooms. College students printed it on posters, t-shirts, and flyers pinned to dorm walls. In one viral photo, a group of teens stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial, fists raised with Jasmine's quote printed on cardboard between them. Someone had added, "We're not waiting to be old to care." The momentum wasn't orchestrated, it was organic, a slow rolling quake across generational lines. Independent voters, those elusive few, began weighing in through open letters, podcast call-ins, and Reddit think pieces. I don't usually get political, one user wrote, but this hit like a reset button. Veterans responded with unexpected solidarity. One former Marine from South Carolina posted a short video, no intro, no music. Just him in his truck saying, "I've served." I know what treason looks like. It doesn't look like Barack Obama, and it damn sure doesn't look like Jasmine Crockett telling the truth. Jasmine watched it unfold from her hotel room phone, in hand, news segments muted but unmistakable. Her face flickered across screens, sometimes praised, sometimes dissected, but that quote, it was everywhere. And this time, no one could cut it mid-sentence. No one could take it out of context. It had already been stamped into the nation's bloodstream. Elijah entered quietly, tablet glowing. We've passed 5 million views. Your words verbatim are being included in 2 commencement addresses, Georgetown and Temple. Jasmine looked up, still quiet, as if her body hadn't yet caught up to the moment. It's not about me anymore, she said almost to herself. It's about what they finally let themselves feel. Because it wasn't anger that powered this new wave. It was permission. Permission to not accept absurdity as normal. Permission to call out propaganda without needing credentials. Permission to believe that courage wasn't performance, it was precision. For the first time in weeks, Jasmine felt something shift, not just in the news cycle, but in the nation's posture. People weren't just listening. They were standing taller, speaking clearer, remembering that democracy is loud but justice is exact. She sat back on the edge of the bed, heart thudding not from exhaustion, but from recognition. What if this wasn't just a viral moment? What if it was a fuse finally lit in a country remembering how to feel the heat again? The first crack came in the most unlikely place, a grainy video from a VFW hall in Columbus, Ohio. Congressman Emmett Moss, staunch conservative, flag on every lapel type, stood before a room of veterans, his hands clasped, eyes tired but alert. A man in the back asked about Jasmine Crockett. The room tensed. Cameras waited, and Moss didn't dodge. I don't agree with her politics, he said flatly. But I watched the full clip. She didn't lie. And in this town, that counts for more than most will admit. Silence. Then a ripple of claps, not for the content, but for the courage of saying it. The video made its way online within hours. It didn't trend, but it didn't need to. It cut. It reached people tired of watching truth be strangled by tribalism. Moss's words weren't praise. They were permission. Then came the second wave, a Vietnam veteran from Georgia, hard-faced and soft-spoken, posting a video from the porch of his small home. I fought for this country, he said, voice firm but measured. And I know propaganda when I hear it. That woman in Congress, she spoke with more honor in 10 minutes than some folks have shown in 10 years. He didn't mention names. He didn't raise his voice. But the clip hit 1 million views in 24 hours. Then, in what no one saw coming, a letter arrived at Jasmine's congressional office. Handwritten, neat cursive, stamped from Little Rock, Arkansas. It was from Judge Wallace Gehring, retired Reagan-appointed, a man who had spent decades cloaked in neutrality and silence. But now he had something to say. Congresswoman, the letter read, I've spent 41 years on the bench. I've watched a generation treat language like strategy and integrity like theater. What I saw in your remarks wasn't defiance, it was devotion. Devotion to words, to meaning, to law. You stood where few do, with poise, precision, and principle. Don't stop. Jasmine read the letter twice, then a third time, then folded it with care, as if it were something fragile. Her team watched from across the room, silent. Not because they didn't have questions, but because they finally understood something was changing. Not with noise, but with clarity. Not with shouting, but with standing still and letting truth echo. Across the country, people who had never agreed on a ballot were now nodding at the same sentence. Not for politics, but for principle. And for the first time since the chaos began, Jasmine didn't feel like she was holding a line alone. She felt the weight shift, just slightly, but enough. Enough to believe, enough to breathe. What if more people refused to stay silent? What if courage wasn't the exception, but the spark that reminded others they had a voice too? The invitation came through just after dawn, subject line, urgent program, Shift Western State University Democracy Forum. Jasmine's team had skimmed past it, at first assuming it was another panel request lost in the post-viral flood. But this wasn't a request. It was a slot one that hadn't existed yesterday. The organizers had reshuffled the closing program, canceling a keynote from a retired senator to make room for someone they said had ignited a moment that could not be ignored. Jasmine read the email twice, then set her phone down slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. Instead, she stared out the window at the soft morning fog curling over Flagstaff rooftops. It wasn't pride that filled her. It was weight. She'd gone from a reaction segment on local news to the final voice at a national forum on democratic integrity. Not because she was scheduled, because she couldn't be left out. She sat at the hotel desk, pen in hand, no laptop, no aides, just silence and a yellow legal pad. She didn't draft a speech. She remembered one. A conversation from a living room in Dallas long ago, her grandfather's voice as constant as the ticking clock behind him. Treason ain't just turning your back on a country, it's betraying the people who still believe in it. That's the definition she carried. Not legalistic, moral. She wrote it down slowly. Treason is betrayal of belief, not power, not party, belief. Every word she planned to speak at that forum would stretch from that seed. She wouldn't talk about Trump. She wouldn't talk about herself. She would talk about the space between truth and silence and what happens when we leave it unguarded. The speech wouldn't be flashy, it would be precise. And in a room full of officials, scholars, students, and skeptics, she would say what no one else had dared to. Outside the hotel, reporters swarmed protest signs, waved cameras, blinked red. But inside her room, Jasmine was still. Her mission was no longer defense. It was definition. She wasn't there to ride the wave of her own moment. She was there to anchor it. Because this time she wouldn't just speak on a panel. She would close the room, frame the silence, and force a nation to ask, who do we become when we let the loudest voice define what treason means? The auditorium at Western State University was packed to the rafters. Students, professors, veterans, press all wedged into rows that creaked under the weight of anticipation. Jasmine stood alone at center stage. No podium, no teleprompter, no slides. Just a mic and a silence so thick it felt ceremonial. She waited a beat, letting the moment settle, not on her, but in the room. When I was 9, she began, voice steady but low. My grandfather pointed at the television and said, That's treason. She let the word hang. Not because a flag burned, not because someone protested, but because a man betrayed the people who still believed in the promise. Murmurs stilled. Pens stopped moving. She had them not through volume, but gravity. She didn't name Trump. She didn't need to. She spoke of betrayal in broader strokes, how public trust, once cracked, doesn't scream when it breaks. It whispers first, and by the time it's loud, it's already rotting from the inside. You can't weaponize patriotism, she said, eyes scanning the front row, then hide behind its corpse when people ask questions. Students leaned forward. Phones stopped recording. The atmosphere shifted, not like a political rally, but a reckoning. Jasmine's voice sharpened, not louder, just clearer. Loud lies will always try to drown quiet truth. That's not new, but what's dangerous now is when silence gets rebranded as neutrality. Then she turned slightly, gaze landing on a cluster of teens near the exit door. Your generation, you're not waiting to be given power. You're inheriting its consequences. And you have to decide what to carry forward. A pause, carry truth. Even when it costs you peace. She stepped back. Let the silence expand. It wasn't empty, it was full. Heavy with breath held too long. Then slowly, like a ripple across still water, hands began to rise. First a few, then a wave. Applause thundered, not for the performance, but for the permission. For someone finally saying what had sat unspoken in the bones of the room. Jasmine didn't bow. Didn't raise a fist. She nodded once firm and walked off stage. Behind her, the sound of clapping swelled like thunder, breaking not tension, but something deeper, because sometimes the most radical act is telling the truth with no apology and letting silence do the rest. Jasmine stepped out of the auditorium and into the cool, open dark. The roar of applause faded behind her like a storm rolling off the edge of a coastline, powerful, spent, unforgettable. But she didn't look back. She walked forward, heels clicking softly against the brick path, breath visible in the crisp Arizona night. There were no cameras now, no speeches left to give. Just the silence that follows when a room full of people has heard something they didn't know they needed until it arrived. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt aligned, like something in her stretch-tested, burned, had finally clicked into place. Not because she had won, but because she had held the line, held the tone, held the meaning of a word that someone had tried to weaponize and returned it to its rightful place. Her path wound past the edge of campus lamplight, flickering over rain-damp grass, the distant hush of footsteps fading in dorm quarters. Somewhere behind her, a student was taping her quote to a hallway bulletin board. Somewhere else, a teacher was rewriting tomorrow's civics lesson. Jasmine didn't need to see it to know it was happening. She paused near a low brick wall and sat down slowly, the night air brushing against her skin like memory. No press releases, no headlines, just the sound of breath. Her own. For the first time in days, she wasn't carrying the weight of rebuttal. She wasn't defending herself. She was remembering what it meant to speak, not for virality, not for sound bites, but for the girl in Nebraska with the mirror, for the veteran in Georgia, for the students who had only heard shouting until now. She whispered to the dark, not for an audience, but as a promise to herself. Truth doesn't echo if no one dares to say it first. And then she stood. The ground felt firmer. Not because the storm was gone, but because she had decided to stand still while it raged. This wasn't closure. This was continuation, a shift, not a finish. Because some truths don't need to be shouted. They need to be lived quietly, firmly, without apology. And as Jasmine walked alone under the fading stars, one question walked with her: when the silence finally lifts, who will have the courage to speak next? By the time Jasmine returned to Washington, the ripple had become a wave. Her office mailbox overflowed, not with press packets or policy memos, but with letters. Handwritten, typed, folded in half and taped shut. Messages from school teachers and Mississippi farmers in Montana, Navy vets in Texas, from college freshmen and retired librarians. They didn't write to ask for help. They wrote to say thank you for reminding them that truth didn't need permission to exist. Twitter became a mosaic of voices, young organizers quoting her on protest signs, veterans sharing stories of watching her speech beside grandkids' parents, posting videos of children repeating her words like new scripture. In a community center in Detroit, someone painted a mural with her quote. In a high school in Idaho, a civics teacher hung a poster. Silence is no longer neutral. It wasn't a movement by design, it was a resonance. Then came the message that stopped her cold. It was a simple photo. A girl barely 13 stood in front of a smudged mirror, her handwriting shaky but determined, scrawled in blue marker on a torn page taped to the glass. I want to say the truth when I'm scared too. No hashtags, no tags, just that. Jasmine stared at the image for a long time, the weight of it pressing deeper than applause ever could. It wasn't about noise, it was about reach. Because now the echo wasn't coming from microphones or media. It was coming from mirrors. And that was proof not of victory, but of connection. Not that she'd spoken, but that someone else had finally heard. The storm hadn't passed, it had simply changed shape. The threats still came, buried in emails masked through burner accounts, folded inside voicemails with fake pleasantries and real malice. The smear campaigns evolved to less cartoonish now, more insidious. Out-of-context quotes, edited footage, claims that she was unstable, divisive, a liability to institutional trust. They didn't want to destroy her message. They wanted to wear her down bit by bit until the silence looked like surrender. But Jasmine didn't break. She adjusted. She woke earlier, walked longer, carried fewer devices and more instinct. She kept a folder now on paper, not cloud-labeled center. Inside, her grandfather's notes on constitutional law, a photo of the girl with the mirror quote, and her own scribbled line from the night everything shifted. Truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to last. There were moments when the weight pressed deeper, alone in hotel rooms, with the curtains drawn in elevators where strangers stared a beat too long, or when staffers asked, "Do you want security walking you to your car tonight?" She always answered the same, "No," not out of bravado, out of balance. If she began to live in fear, they'd already won the first war. Still, she knew what this life cost. A piece of peace, a slice of privacy, And every now and then, the ache of wondering if being the first to speak means you'll be the last to rest. But when Jasmine closed her eyes and asked herself, would I do it again, knowing what it would take, the answer didn't shake. Yes, because public truth doesn't belong to the safe. It belongs to the steady, to the voices that crack but don't fold, to the women who cry in private and stand tall in public, not because they want to be strong, but because the moment requires it. And in that clarity, Jasmine understood her strength wasn't in surviving the noise. It was in choosing to speak anyway while still feeling everything. The lights in the studio dimmed long after the cameras stopped rolling, but Jasmine's voice lingered, not as sound, but as presence. She stood not as a politician, but as a daughter, a granddaughter, a woman who had been called too loud, too direct, too much, and yet never enough for the comfort of power. She remembered her grandfather's quiet warning, spoken under the porch light, one humid Texas night. Your voice isn't just for you, baby. It's for the one who can't speak yet. That was why she spoke, not to win arguments, but to carve space. Not to be safe, but to be seen. Because silence, when wrapped in fear, becomes consent. And history never remembers the people who stayed quiet in rooms that demanded courage. So she left the mic warm, not for applause, but for permission. To the teacher biting her tongue in a meeting, to the soldier watching truth rot under slogans, to the student who hasn't yet found the words. This moment wasn't hers alone. It was borrowed, temporary, a bridge. And with eyes steady and voice unwavering, Jasmine ended not with a speech, but a question. What truth are you ready to speak when it's the hardest moment to do so? Because change doesn't begin when someone talks. It begins when someone listens and says, me too. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.